Last, we left off with the personal testimony of a man named Dr. John Drew. Who is Dr. Drew? Well, he is now a conservative journalist who contributes to such publications as The American Thinker, Breitbart, Campus Reform, PJ Media, The College Fix, Front Page Magazine, and WorldNet Daily. He received his PhD in government from Cornell University and has taught political science and economics at Cornell, Hope International University, the University of Oregon, and Williams College. However, Dr. Drew was once a militant Marxist who spent his graduate years at Occidental College, during which time he met a young Obama in 1980 at the home of his then girlfriend, Caroline Boss. Barack Obama enrolled at Occidental College the autumn semester of 1979, where he would quickly become part of a vibrant network of student activists, honing his skills as an orator, protesting such injustices as the ongoing imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. After spending 2 years at Occidental, or from the age of 18 to 19, Obama would transfer to Columbia University in 1981. Now, here's where things really start to heat up. Again, who was Bill Ayers? William Ayers was born on December 26th, 1944 in Glen Ellen, Illinois. Still alive. Very little is known about his mother, but his father, Thomas Ayers, was the CEO of Commonwealth Edison from 1973 to 1980. Ayers, like so many of his comrades and co-conspirators, were not red diaper babies like many of those of the Stalinist left that had preceded him. Now, what do I mean when I say that? What I mean is, in the 1920s, 1930s, during the height of the Red Scare, as it was called, okay, we saw the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, when Vladimir Lenin and his small cadre overthrew the provisional government of Russia, thanks to the aid and the help that was granted them by way of Germany. Many of the pro-Stalinist left in America were first-generation Americans whose parents fled parts of Eastern Europe to escape the scourge of anti-Semitism. I mentioned the neo-communist left, or the new left, was kind of like this sort of anti-Stalinist left. The new left was the sort of byproduct of the publishing of an intel document that was made public by Israeli intelligence of something. It became known as the Khrushchev report. And the Khrushchev report was published in the New York Times, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, based upon my research, I think the year was 1956, 1957. The left pretty much had to go back to the drawing board, because the whole Leninist, Stalinist line of the Marxist perspective was, of course, one that believed in this concept of a revolutionary vanguard. That meaning that the mother Russia was the sort of heartbeat, or the strength was the muscle, so to speak, of the global proletariat. Because in order for there to be this international workers' revolution, there must only be one sort of solitary voice that dictates to the proletariat the world over. Once the wider public found out about the horrors that were taking place inside of Russia proper, it forced the left the world over to sort of reevaluate. So the new left, or the neo-communist left, had to reevaluate itself and sort of never mind the Soviet Union, so to speak. It had to find anew. It had to find a new cause, a new calling card. And its new calling card, that being the neo-communist left, became this anti-colonialism and this emphasis on the sort of the quote-unquote liberation of the third world. Bill Ayers, back to Ayers. Ayers enrolled at the University of Michigan in 1964, where, like Obama 20 years later, he would become a student activist, participating in the university's first teach-in, and was arrested for a sit-in at the Ann Arbor Selective Service Office. Now, sometime during the late 1960s, Ayers would become a member of the infamous Students for a Democratic Society, known more by its acronym SDS. By 1969, Ayers had become co-head along with a woman by the name of Diana Oughton. Now, remember the name Diana Oughton. He became co-head along with Diana Oughton of a splinter group that formed within the SDS known as the Jesse James Gang. The Jesse James Gang, which sort of acted as a kind of predecessor to a group that you all are familiar with, known as the Weathermen. Now, we're going to pause for a second on Ayers because I want to get into the background of the Students for a Democratic Society. Now, Students for a Democratic Society was founded in the 1930s as the youth wing of a group founded in 1921 called the Student League for Industrial Democracy. This group was founded by three men: Norman Thomas, Jack London, and Upton Sinclair. Mind you, I'm going to give a brief synopsis of those three, but those three gentlemen alone, Norman Thomas, Jack London, and Upton Sinclair, those three men in and of themselves deserve a 2-3 hour lecture, just those three men alone. Now, the Student League for Industrial Democracy was itself an offshoot of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, which was founded in 1905 by Upton Sinclair, Walter Lippmann, Jack London, and Clarence Darrow, a favorite of the Soviet Union and the Comintern. He was their hero. He was their champion. Again, there were so many names, so many organizations that I just couldn't name for the sake of time. From the National Lawyers Guild to the American Civil Liberties Union, on and on and on. All of these front groups for left-wing extremism, front groups for the proliferation and for the promotion of Marxist secularism, progressivism, atheism. Men like Clarence Darrow, Walter Lippmann were at the forefront of the corrosion and the corruption of American culture, American politics, and of American education. But I'm going to move on. The Intercollegiate Society was fashioned by its founders as the American version or branch of the London, England-based Fabian Society. Now, follow me. Now, you may have heard me mention the Fabian Society in the past. As a matter of fact, the Fabian Society even came up during my discussion on Martin Luther King Jr. So we've gone from the Fabian Society to the Intercollegiate Socialist Society to the Student League for Industrial Democracy to the Students for a Democratic Society. Notice how the mask changed, but the face stays the same. Now, let's get into these three individuals. Norman Thomas, born November 20th, 1884, died December 19th, 1968, was a Presbyterian minister who was a 6-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America. Thomas, an alum of the famed Union Theological Seminary. Those of you who are in the know, when you hear of the institution Union Theological Seminary, alarm bells should be going off. He described himself as a pacifist and a quote unquote Christian socialist, not unlike Walter Rauschenbusch, of course, who was the philosophical and theological inspiration of MLK. Now, Jack London, and keep Norman Thomas in mind as well, because he comes up again later as well. Now, Jack London was born. Jack London, whose born name was John Griffith Chaney, was born January 12th, 1876, and died on November 22nd, 1976. Was a novelist, journalist, and activist who tried his hand at politics, but is best known for his work as a writer and essayist. London joined the Socialist Labor Party in 1896, but left the party in 1901 and joined the upstart Socialist Party of America. Not to mention, of course, that he was a devout atheist. Now, Upton Sinclair. Who was he? Well, he was born September 20th, 1878, and died on November 25th, 1968, same year Norman Thomas died. He was a writer, political activist, and was the 1934 Democrat Party nominee for the governorship of California. He also ran 2 unsuccessful congressional bids on the Socialist Party ticket in 1920 for the House and in 1922 for the Senate. Sinclair wrote nearly 100 books and won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1943. Aside from his political and social writings, Sinclair also took an interest in the occult, experimenting with such phenomena as telekinesis and telepathy. So there were these sort of anti-communist socialist groups in the world and in America, especially. I mean, you had certain groups, again, like the Students for a Democratic Society or the Student League for Industrial Democracy, claimed to be an anti-communist organization. You know, the same can be said of other groups as well, who were socialist in terms of their ideology, but they claimed to reject communism, and anyone claiming to be a member of the Communist Party was not allowed membership to these organizations, so they claim. Now, even if they were, even if they meant this and did their best to enforce this rule, of course, some would inevitably slip through the cracks. You know, again, these were one of these organizations, the NAACP, which was a socialist organization, claimed on the surface to be an anti-communist organization. There were, staunch left-wing socialist labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who by all accounts was a kind of anti-Stalinist, anti-communist American socialist. But and for that, A. Philip Randolph, whether he, voluntarily disassociated himself with certain organizations that he helped to start, like the National Negro Congress, which was a communist front, or whether he was thrown out, A. Philip Randolph is another socialist who was an alleged anti-communist. As a matter of fact, just to kind of drive the point home even further, that NATO, of course, NATO being, they say, was this sort of a sort of coalition, an allegiance, an alliance of states put together for the purpose of mounting a defense against the Soviet Union and its bloc states, right? But as point of fact, NATO was the mastermind. That there were many socialist and socialist groups that played a huge hand in the creation of NATO. That may be something that I'll revisit in the future. Now, I bring that up because the year 1959 marked a radical shift in the group's mission and focus, when it lifted its longtime ban on the inclusion of known communists into the organization. This led to the merge, some would call it, with the Progressive Labor Party. The League, as it were, would officially split from its youth wing, SDS, in 1965. So you sort of had the industrial democracy and the democratic society sort of being the student sort of branch. And once the student branch began to grow ever more radical, the League, which sort of saw itself as an anti-communist socialist group, because the student wing began to invite communists into its ranks, they split apart from them in 1965. By the mid to late 1960s, Students for a Democratic Society had approximately 30,000 members in 300 chapters across the country, making it the largest student organization in the country. Now, when you think of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, who comes to mind? Tom Hayden. Now, who is Tom Hayden? Thomas Emmett Hayden was born December 11th, 1939 in Royal Oak, Michigan, and died on October 23rd, 2006 in Santa Monica, California. Hayden attended the University of Michigan as an undergrad from 1957 to 1961, and then again as a graduate student from 1963 to 1964. So now we're seeing the overlap between he and Ayers. He and Ayers probably met sometime around 1964. Hayden, like Ayers, was also no red diaper baby, but according to the statements of those close to Hayden, Hayden had a pathological hatred for anyone and anything, for anyone and everything. No one quite knew where it came from. He just had this chip on his shoulder that only his radical politics could seem to assuage. Now, Hayden served as the president of the SDS from 1962 to 1963 and was the author of the first draft of the notorious Port Huron Statement, which was written on June 15th, 1962. The Port Huron Statement is key because the Port Huron Statement is seen somewhat as the definitive document or statement that officially began or identified and gave birth to the neo-communist left. Here is an excerpt from the closing of the Port Huron Statement. In summary, a more reformed, more human capitalism functioning at three-fourths capacity, while 1/3 of America and 2/3 of the world goes needy. Domination of politics and economy by fantastically rich elites. Accommodation and limited effectiveness by the labor movement. Hardcore poverty and unemployment. Automation confirming the dark ascension of machine over man instead of shared abundance. Technological change being introduced into the economy by the criteria of profitability. This has been our inheritance. However inadequate, it has instilled quiescence in liberal hearts, partly reflecting the extent to which misery has overcome, but also the eclipse of social ideals. So what Hayden is saying in so many words is that he is saying that this whole capitalism thing, it's working. I get it. He said the quiescence in liberal hearts. You all think you've made it. We are now affluent and comfortable. And all throughout the Port Huron Statement, again, once the Khrushchev report was published after the death of Joseph Stalin, it marked somewhat of a shift. And it was almost like this power grab amongst independent Marxists in the United States to sort of redefine what Marxism would mean moving forward, seeing as how Joseph Stalin and his deeds had done a lot in the way of sort of disgracing the progressive movement. A progressive movement, by the way, that aside from Joseph Stalin was held together, was sort of underpinned by the writings and the teachings and the philosophies of the father one of the great patron saints of progressivism, that being none other than John Dewey. Because John Dewey is the line that pretty much connects the Stalinist left with the post-Stalinist neo-communist left. But throughout the Port Huron statement, you had Hayden lambasting both superpowers, that being the United States and the Soviet Union, for keeping the globe locked into a kind of status quo, which sort of prevented, as you can see here, it says, partly reflecting the extent to which misery has been overcome. So we've overcome our misery, but also the eclipse of social ideals. So what Hayden is saying, and what he says all throughout the Port Huron statement, is pretty much, do not become complacent. Do not allow comfortability to settle you and allow you to trade in that comfort, or to exchange your ideals for that comfort. Don't sell out, in so many words. Though many of us are affluent, and he puts affluent in quotations. Though many of us are affluent, poverty, waste, elitism, manipulation are too manifest to go unnoticed, too clearly unnecessary to go accepted. This is Hayden in the 1960s. Tom Hayden is one of the key figures who brought forth in the 1960s and 1970s the countercultural scourge that led to the acceleration of our society's social and political decline. It wasn't the reality of the situation. It was the way in which the youth in particular were convinced that they ought to behave in response to life's challenges, many of which challenges, were completely illusory. They were made up in the minds of the activists and shoved down the throats of anyone who was unfortunate enough to voluntarily listen or were made to listen. To change the Cold War status quo and other social evils, concerned with the challenges to the American economic machine must expand. So we must expand the degree to which we criticize, because we mustn't become complacent during the era of this nuclear Cold War standoff. Now, the true author, or at least the brains behind the Port Huron statement, is believed to be a man named Richard Flax. Remember the name Richard Flax. He's going to come up again later as well. He's believed to be Tom Hayden's mentor and was also a fellow member of the SDS. Now, Hayden, of course, is most known for what? Hayden is most known for his integral role in the 1968 riot in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. Now, this is believed to be the coup, if you will, of the Democrat Party. This is when, of course, the Democrat Party went completely off the rails and was successfully infiltrated by the radical left. Some say communist post-World War II saw the Democrat Party more so than the Republican Party as being the party of war, the warmonger. See, remember, from FDR, of course, came Harry Truman, the Korean War, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, etc., etc., sending aid to Greece and to Turkey, the rehabilitation of Western Europe, particularly Germany. Men like Frank Marshall Davis, of course, when you're talking about Obama, you're going to bring up Frank Marshall Davis. Frank Marshall Davis was one of many left-wing mouthpieces that during the 1940s was accusing Harry Truman of trying to reinstitute the Nazi regime in Germany after World War II. Because, of course, the United States was trying to prevent the Soviets from, of course, conquering sort of beyond the Baltic. And so this became the charge. And so Harry Truman became the poster child of Western imperialism, became the poster child of American fascism, of American Nazism, and of American aggression. Why? Because the United States, due to its interference, you hear a lot of this nonsense being bandied about today. It is even being bandied about by way of a lot of so-called conservatives who, because the United States was interfering in foreign affairs, communists in the United States was accusing the United States of preventing a lot of these countries in the haze and fog of post-World War II fallout. Leftists in the United States were accusing the United States of preventing these countries from establishing their own democracies, quote unquote, or, undermining their right to self-determination. But what the left-wing saboteurs were trying to do in the United States was prevent the American government by way of social pressure from getting involved in the political goings on in countries where the Soviet Union had a mutual stake in assuring that those countries either became Soviet satellites or part of the Soviet empire proper. Do you understand? Because after World War II, right about the midpoint of the 20th century, when you also had this anti-colonial fervor that was sweeping the country, in the midst of the Cold War, you had this sort of mad grab going on between the world's two leading superpowers to sort of get these countries that were vying for independence to claim or align themselves with one country or the other, respectively. And so whenever the United States, or if the United States, this was the thinking, if the United States could retreat from certain areas, say, for example, like it did in China, if it could pull back from certain areas, this would allow the Soviet Union to then come in and take over from where the United States had retreated. So all of you people who think that we live in a world of 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 centuries ago, who think that global alliances are of no importance, that having a military presence outside of your own country is of no importance, that if a country who is being invaded by a mutual enemy, a country whose internal goings on, if it is not on the up and up, can serve as a potential threat to your own national security. If you do not feel the need to help another country in need in times of conflict, when the potential demise of that country could very well pose a risk to your own national security, let me just tell you this. I am so thankful that you ain't running shit. I am so thankful that you don't run a damn thing but your mouth on social media. And that's all I'm going to say to y'all. Because I don't know what the hell world you think you live in. Because if it ain't you, it's going to be somebody else. All right. Now let's move on, because I know I done made a lot of y'all mad. So again, the Democrat Party, starting with Truman, was sort of like the object of ire for communists in the United States, because again, they saw the Democrat Party as the party of warmongers. Beginning with Truman, of course, and again, there was some flack again toward Eisenhower, but it didn't necessarily quiet down. But again, there was this kind of brief respite during that period. And then again, once the baby boomers came of age in the 1960s, is when they began to ramp up once again. And of course, JFK, who the left despised, and of course, the left, long before they hated Nixon, they hated JFK, and they also hated LBJ. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? That's one of their favorite slogans, the radical anti-war left. Now, the chief organizers of the riot were beaten, gassed, arrested, and charged with conspiracy. That's how one source put it. The conspirators became known as the Chicago Eight. These eight consisted of Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Bobby Seale, David Dillinger, Rennie Davis, John Fornés, and Lee Weiner. They eventually, of course, became the Chicago Seven when the decision was made to try Bobby Seale individually. In short, Seale was sentenced to 4 years for contempt of court, which was overturned in 1972. And the remaining seven were acquitted of all conspiracy charges. Now, y'all may have, it's funny, y'all. It's just amazing how evil, wicked, corrupt, and unjust the American legal system is. And everywhere you look up, every time, every significant instance, whether we're talking a riot, from political agitation to outright murder in the streets, how many of these men and women involved in conspiracies and in crimes, if they were tried, were oftentimes acquitted, or if they were convicted, they later had their cases overturned thanks to ideologically sympathetic legal apparatchiks operating within our legal system, because our society has been infested from top to bottom in every social sector with Marxists here, there, everywhere. I sound like a Dr. Seuss book, but yet no justice, no peace, while they run roughshod over our republic. It is hardly a republic, or at least one that any of us or any of our forefathers would recognize. The reality is that it was a conspiracy orchestrated by Tom Hayden and his cadre, and they went to Chicago to deliberately start a fuss and to start a riot at the Democrat National Convention. As fate would have it, they chose Chicago not simply because it was the site of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, but it was also the mayoral home of none other than Richard J. Daley. And the reason why that is significant is because you have the Democrat National Convention, I think, in August of that year. 2 months prior, RFK gets assassinated. 3-4 months prior, Martin Luther King is assassinated in April 4th, 1968. Now, both events set off a string of riots. In Chicago in particular, of course, and this is often cited, that it was Mayor Richard J. Daley that gave police in Chicago shoot to kill orders. This is the reason why, and this is coming by way of those who knew Tom Hayden personally and were personally involved in the organizing of the 1968 Democrat National Convention riot, who was there when the planning occurred. And Chicago was strategically picked because they knew that Chicago's law enforcement would get aggressive with them. Now, of course, we are all familiar with Hayden's famous wife, Jane Fonda, to whom he was married for 17 years. They married in 1973 and divorced in 1990. Fonda herself would travel to Hanoi, which was the North Vietnamese capital, in 1972, which resulted in her receiving the pejorative from her critics of Hanoi Jane. Much of the controversy stemmed from photos that were taken of her sitting in an anti-aircraft gun, appearing as though she was shooting down American aircraft. Fonda claims that she vehemently tried to block those photos from being published. Fonda claims she was protesting the U.S. the U.S. government, not the troops. Again, this is a complete and utter fraud. This is a complete and utter lie. Those longing for the demise of the West they always make that excuse. I'm not here saying that there cannot be a legitimate, conscientious, good faith objection to a war or to a conflict. I'm not saying that. But when you're talking about whole scale, systematic, formulaic, protracted, concentrated agitation, you're not talking about a good faith objection to a war. You're not talking about an anti-war movement. You're talking about an anti-American movement. That's what Jane Fonda was standing up for. That's what Jane Fonda was representing. May I remind you, this is the same Jane Fonda who once said, and I quote, this is Fonda, if, some of you are probably familiar with this quote, if you understood what communism was, you would hope, you would pray on your knees that we would someday become communist. I, a socialist, think we should strive toward a socialist society all the way to communism. End quote. That is Jane Fonda, the very same Jane Fonda you still see today, the same Jane Fonda from the old workout videos. This is the same Jane Fonda who, to this day, has been trying to make excuses for her despicable acts going all the way back to the 1970s. Or it gets even worse than that. Again, Jane Fonda is another individual who deserves her own Teach 'em Chuck deconstruction. And maybe I'll get her one day. Jane Fonda's father, Henry Fonda, was a member of the 1947 Committee for the First Amendment. The 1947 Committee for the First Amendment was a committee that was created in order to legally, politically push back against the unconstitutional overreach of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC. The 1947 Committee for the First Amendment was, of course, spearheaded or led by perhaps the most famous actor in America at the time, Humphrey Bogart, which, of course, if you are familiar with some of my previous talks, I went into detail about the air of suspicion hovering over the head of Humphrey Bogart, who may have very well been a member of the Communist Party himself. But I won't get into that today. But the Committee for the First Amendment was, of course, another communist front group. Now, Fonda's trip, my boy Chad, what's happening? Fonda's trip and subsequent speeches were organized by a man named Wilford Burchett, who, according to KGB defector Yuri Kratkov, was a spy for the Soviet Union. Hayden and Fonda would become a tabloid magazine cover couple, appearing on the front of People magazine on June 23rd, 1975, and again on May 24th, 1982. Ain't that cute? Hayden enjoyed a lengthy career in politics in the state of California's Democrat Party machine from the mid-'70s to the early 2000s, along with a vibrant academic career where he taught at Pitzer College, Occidental College, Harvard University's Institute of Politics, and the University of California, Los Angeles. Again, Chad is a revisionist. I'm a revisionist. Mind you, nearly every single solitary person that I name in this discussion has either a link to education or have been or are flat out professors at a major American university today, or at some point was. And you wonder why history is told the way in which it is. How in the world does a man like Tom Hayden become a prominent professor at an American university where he gets to teach and spot off this BS? Your boy, Bill Ayers, a professor at the University of Illinois College of Education. His wife, Bernadine Dorn, a professor of law, I believe, at Columbia University. I can go on and on and on. But we're revisionists. You make that make sense, because these are the types of people that are telling you your history. These folks who are themselves also unrepentant. It's not like, again, I mentioned Columbia University in the past as well. Now, when you're talking about Columbia University, or when you're talking about a university or institutions, period, for Christ's sake, we can talk about, the Federal Reserve, this institution, that institution. Let me tell you something right now. If you gave me a choice in terms of what institution, if I had my pick of the litter for institutions that I would shut down immediately, I don't know if there has been a more destructive institution in the history of America than Columbia University. And I get it, albeit our hero, one of our heroes, the great Dr. Thomas Sowell, received his master's degree from Columbia University. I know there are some exceptions to the rule, but even he would tell you that Columbia University ain't worth a you know what. That's just a side note, a sidebar. But again, these are the folk, these people. In 2011, remember, this is one of the reasons, this is how we remember Bill Ayers. Remember, because the New York Times printed an interview it conducted with Bill Ayers that was published the very same day of the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks. Remember. And within that interview, in that article printed in the New York Times, Bill Ayers, quote, said that I still admire the eloquence and the poetry of explosives. I do not regret my activities that I partook in back in the 1970s. As a matter of fact, I wish we had done more. This man went on to become a professor of education at the University of Illinois. You wonder why your history is told the way in which it is. Now, let's move back to Chicago. And let's get into the days of rage and the birth of the Weathermen. This is the section of my outline here. The days of rage and the birth of the Weathermen. What are the days of rage? The days of rage were a series of riots during 3 days of upheaval in Chicago from October 8th to October 11th. This was 1969. Building off of the success of the 1968 riot, the goal was to create a national action in the streets to end America's involvement in the Vietnam War. This effort was chiefly organized by an emerging leader within the SDS crowd, the aforementioned Bill Ayers. Now, side note, throughout the days of rage, you had all types of student activists coming in from all parts of the country, especially Chicago, New York, Detroit, etc., right? And you might think, well, what the hell did they do for 3 days? Where did they stay? Where did they lodge? Where did they eat? Who fed them? Who sheltered them? Well, guess who pitched in to lend a hand to the peaceful protesters? The churches. Most notably, a church in Chicago called University Disciple Church. But they weren't the only church. There were a multitude of churches that housed the young radicals. But they made 2 exceptions to the help they gave. They said, well, you can stay at the church and you can lodge here, but we have 2 rules. No weapons, no guns, no drugs. Both rules, of course, were violated. And mind you, This is how the rioters largely evaded arrest from the police, because the police was apprehensive and were hesitant to kick down the door of a church. You see how they do. You have to understand the tactics of the left and how low down they get. Even the church was more upset at the police and their treatment of the rioters than they were when it came to the rioters themselves. And the police could not get to a lot of the rioters because the rioters had safe refuge at many of Chicago's local churches. The days of rage and the assistance that were given to the SDS thanks to the local churches in Chicago. If you don't believe me, once again, you can look this up and see if I'm wrong. By December of that same year, the Weathermen were born. Now it's finna get hot. They commissioned what they called a war council meeting in Flint, Michigan on December 27th, 1969. Key members, many if not all of whom were present at this inaugural gathering, included Ayers, his soon-to-be wife, Bernadine Dorn, Jeff Jones, he was Bernadine Dorn's boyfriend before Ayers, but Jeff Jones, Michael Klonsky, Carl Davison, John Jacobs, Kathy Bodin, and Mark Rudd. Remember those names, all of them. Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, Jeff Jones, Michael Klonsky, Carl Davison, John Jacobs, Kathy Bodin, and Mark Rudd were among the 400 students that met in Flint, Michigan on December 27th, 1969. We know of what was said at this meeting thanks in large part to the personal memoir and biography that was written by Mark Rudd. But Mark Rudd, I can't remember the year that his autobiography was published, but if you are interested in reading it, his autobiography is titled Underground, subtitled My Life with SDS and the Weathermen. Underground, My Life with SDS and the Weathermen. Here is Mark Rudd's account of what took place at the War Council meeting that took place in Flint, Michigan in 1969. John Jacobs addressed the group saying, now these are just some quotes, just to get you in the frame of mind of what was in their frame of mind at the time. John Jacobs would say, "We are against everything that is good and decent." Bernadine Dorn would say, "We're about being crazy motherfuckers and scaring the shit out of hunky America." Mind you, I don't know if it was a black, brown, red, yellow face in sight. All approximately 400 of these fools was as white as snow. And this is how they talking. Mark Rudd would say, "It's a wonderful feeling to hit a pig. It must really be a wonderful feeling to kill a pig and to blow something up." Kathy Bodin would say of the mothers of white children, calling them pig mothers. And singing, of course, this was around Christmas time. She, made a play on Ben Crosby's song, famous song, "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas," by singing "I'm Dreaming of a White Riot." Remember the name Kathy Bodin too, because she's going to come up later. And also, of course, remember the name Mark Rudd. Bernadine Dorn would go the furthest. Let me move back to Dorn. She would go the furthest, however, saying of the Sharon Tate murders. Now, you all know who Sharon Tate is, right? Sharon Tate was the spouse, the wife of Roman Polanski. Again, y'all, Roman Polanski, I go over in the corner with your blocks, your crayons, and your coloring books and go play with the flat earthers. All right. I get it, but we just gonna deal with what we know. All right. Now, we all know Sharon Tate, she wasn't the only victim. She wasn't the only one to perish at the home of Roman Polanski at the hands of the Manson cult. But again, she being the most famous person, of course, this is, known simply more so as just simply the Sharon Tate murder, the Sharon Tate murders, the Manson cult Sharon Tate murders. Here's what Bernadine Dorn said of the Sharon Tate murders. She says, dig it. First, they killed those pigs. Then they ate dinner in the same room with them. Then they even shoved a fork in the victim's stomach. Wild. And of course, this became known as the Weather Salute. The four fingers. For the four prongs on the fork that was left in the pregnant stomach of Sharon Tate. Now, of course, Weatherman, of course, was a play on a famous Bob Dylan song. This is where they got their name from. They got their name from Bob Dylan. I forgot the name of the Bob Dylan song. Some of y'all in the comment section could probably help me out. But the famous line in this famous Bob Dylan song was, of course, that you don't have to be a weatherman to know where the wind blows. Now, Rudd would also go on to say in his memoir, detailing the zeitgeist of the group, so to speak, that we shit on all of your conventional values, you murderers of black revolutionaries and Vietnamese babies. There was no limit to our politics of transgression. There is no limit to our politics of transgression. Again, you murderers of black revolutionaries and Vietnamese babies. It has long been rumored as well that members of the group were in contact with Cuban revolutionaries via the Cuban embassy in Canada. But again, that's largely just rumored, because even to this day, former members of the Weather Underground refuse to fully disclose what connections, if any, they had to the Cuban government. Now, the Weathermen would go on to take credit for approximately 25 bombings, including the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, the U.S. State Department building in D.C., the California Attorney General's office, and a New York City police station. Some of their other notable attacks or attempted attacks were the bombing of Park Police Station in San Francisco on February 16th, 1970, which, according to the San Francisco Police Officers Association, the Weathermen were responsible, but no one to this day has actually been charged. That is the official stance of the San Francisco Police Officers Association to this very day. No one has been charged, and they know very well, or have under good suspicion, that Ayers and his cadre were in fact responsible. The attempted bombing of Fort Dix Army Base in New Jersey, during which time a dance was to be held for returning Vietnam soldiers and their dates, girlfriends, and wives. However, members of the group were assembling the nail bomb in Greenwich Village when the bomb exploded unexpectedly, killing 3 weathermen. The 3 weathermen that were killed in this accidental explosion were Diana Oughton. Remember her? She's dead now. Diana Oughton, as a matter of fact, as point of fact, side note, her father was a wealthy banker. She was another one. Again, a bunch of stupid ass, spoiled, indoctrinated children. Don't know their elbow from their asshole. Don't know shit from Shinola. A bunch of stupid, spoiled children. And now Diana Oughton is dead because she tried to make a bomb which was meant to detonate at an army base where a dance was to be held for soldiers returning home from Vietnam. She's dead now. And her great-grandfather is said to have played a key role in the founding of the Boy Scouts of America. Diana Oughton was also a U of M alumni. Also, the other 2 weathermen dead were Terry Robbins and Ted Gold. Now, Kathy Bowden, she was also present, but she survived. They also planned on bombing a Detroit Police Officers Association building, but the bombing never occurred. Now, the deaths of Auden, Robbins, and Gold turned them into new martyrs for the revolutionary cause. The Weathermen would go on to draft a manifesto published in July of 1974 titled Prairie Fire, The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism. Please go and read the Prairie Fire Manifesto. It's about 160 something pages long. You can get through it in a day if you focus. I highly urge you all to go and read the Prairie Fire Manifesto. The foreword features a photo of the three dead Weathermen with the words, "Three of our comrades who gave their lives in the struggle. March 6th, 1970. This perhaps marked the group's transition from the Weathermen to the Weather Underground." Now, of course, the Weather Underground, because, the movement had to go underground, because if the United States was ever going to be successfully Sovietized, they had to trigger the revolution by violent means. The time of talking and theorizing was over. This was their belief, because they were taking their marching orders from the new patron saint of the communist movement post the death of Joseph Stalin, which was Che Guevara. Now, the Prairie Fire Manifesto was written and signed by Bernardine Dorn, Bill Ayers, Jeff Jones, there's Jeff Jones again, and Celia Sojourn. Now, here's an excerpt from the Prairie Fire Manifesto. I'm going to read this. "We are a guerrilla organization. We are communist men and women underground in the United States for more than 4 years. We need a revolutionary communist party in order to lead the struggle. Give coherence and direction to the fight. Seize power and build the new society. We have only begun. The only possibilities are victory or death. Our intention is to disrupt the empire of American imperialism, to incapacitate it. The only path to the final defeat of imperialism and the building of socialism is revolutionary war. Without armed struggle, there can be no victory." Again, this document is 163 pages long and free online for anyone who wants to read it. And of course, they were taking their marching orders from the new patron saint of the left, Che Guevara, who once said, "You must," say it with me, y'all. Y'all know Che Guevara's famous quote, "You must create you must create 2, 3 mini Vietnams to destroy U.S. imperialism. And you must open another front within the United States itself." Again, you have to understand, you had the Cuban Revolution. So now, so imagine if you're this young, idealistic, pie in the sky, young Marxist graduate student, and and this is your dream. This is your you want to socialize. You've bought into the dreams and the promises of Marx's theories on economics, politics, etc. Right? So the goal of, I guess, containment, right, was to, again, contain the Soviet Union by especially keeping communism out of the Western Hemisphere. So now you have communism clearly afoot in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, with Cuba, of course, taking the lead. Now you have other Latin American countries, Spanish-speaking countries in Central and South America. Colombia. Later on, we would have Grenada and Nicaragua and so on. And of course, Venezuela decades later in the night. And so Here you have communism in the Western Hemisphere. By then, you pretty much had the United States all pretty much not militarily defeated, but the United States had been politically defeated in Indochina. So the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese in particular, had defeated the United States. Cuba had become communist. So now, like dominoes, the belief was that more and more countries in the Western Hemisphere was going to become communist. And to quote Vladimir Lenin, the United States would fall like ripe fruit into the hands of the Soviet Union. So they're thinking in their minds, this is it. It's over. The United States is done. Finito. It's about to fall. The only thing that we must do now is do our part, which is instigate the toppling of the United States from within. And we're going to do that through revolution. So you guys have to think of what the world must have looked like to them in the 1970s. It was on. Right? They didn't see the future that was to come. Now, the four authors, this is another side note here, but not so much a side note because we're still talking about the Weatherman and the Prayer Fire document, Now, the four authors also dedicated their manifesto to Sirhan Sirhan. Who was Sirhan Sirhan? You all know who Sirhan Sirhan is. He was a pro-Palestinian Jordanian extremist and the assassin of Robert F. Kennedy. Sirhan was radicalized by his opposition to Israel's conquest of the Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem at the end of the Six-Day War. Again, y'all, I'm not using this as some cheap opportunity to talk about Israel and Palestine. I'm not doing that. Again, there's no way. How could I have done that? They're the ones who dedicated the Prayer Fire Manifesto to Sirhan Sirhan. I didn't do it. So, you're talking about one of the most famous and tragic assassinations in America's history. Why wouldn't I mention it? They mentioned it. I'm just telling you about Sirhan Sirhan. He directed his fury toward Senator Kennedy for his public support of Israel during his 1968 presidential campaign. The assassination of RFK took place 1 year after the start of the Six-Day War, and bystanders recall hearing Sirhan say upon his apprehension that, quote, "I did it for my country," unquote. We also know of much of the goings on within the Weathermen thanks to the 1974 Senate testimony of FBI informant Larry Grathwohl. Now, I know many of you know who Larry Grathwohl is. I know you all have heard his name. If you do not know who Larry Grathwohl is, please familiarize yourself with him. You can read his book he wrote titled "Bringing Down America: An FBI Informer with the Weathermen," or you can watch the 1982 documentary featuring Grathwohl titled "No Place to Hide: The Strategy and Tactics of Terrorism." Many of you have probably seen this documentary. You can go and pull it up on YouTube right now. It is free. It's only about an hour long. The title again is "No Place to Hide: The Strategy and Tactics of Terrorism." If you don't want to read Larry Grathwohl's book, go and watch that documentary. It's free on YouTube. I'm going to give you a little bit of spoiler because part of what really blew my mind about Larry Grathwohl and what he disclosed in that documentary is when he talked about the meeting he had with the Weathermen at one point. And, he was sitting around, and I can't remember who he said was in attendance at that meeting. Ayers may have been an attendee at this meeting. And they were talking about what would happen, what the country was going to look like in the wake of this overthrow of the United States. What was going to happen in the wake of this revolution? And Larry Grathwohl said that he was taken aback by the fact that none of them seemed to really have a plan. He asked them, he said, well, what kind of economic system would there be? What kind of economic structure would we have? He said no one had an answer. He said, what kind of political system? How would you clothe people? How will we feed people? No one had an answer. Larry Grathwohl said, and I'm paraphrasing, that they seemed to assume that the United States would be essentially colonized or annexed by the sort of four major communist superpowers, and that the United States would be broken up into quadrants. One part controlled by Russia, Soviet Russia, the other part controlled by communist China, the other part controlled by Cuba, and I guess the other part controlled by, it was either North Korea or North Vietnam. And he said, wow. So Grathwohl asked, he said, well, what about the people who are unwilling to get on board with the new system? He said, well, their response was, this is the weathermen who were in the room. He said, they'll have to be killed. He said, well, how many of them do you think? He says, well, we'll probably end up killing about 25 million. Now, what struck me about this, and what struck Grathwohl about this, and he says this in the documentary, he says that it was so surreal. He said, you can't imagine being in a room with people. And he said, this is what struck him. He said, these were educated adults, young adults, some of whom had PhDs, educated, master's degrees, PhDs, some from Ivy League institutions, sitting around in a room plotting the systematic extermination of 25 million people. He said it was so surreal. He said you couldn't even imagine what was going on in my mind. And he said, I quote, they were dead serious. 25 million people, a group of Ivy League educated human beings plotting how they were going to murder 25 million people. That's what their education amounted to. That's what all this fairness and social justice and equity bullshit amounts to. Corpses. Go and watch that documentary if you haven't seen it, or if you just haven't seen any material or interviews conducted with Larry Grathwohl, and his last name is spelled Grathwohl. I advise you do so, and that should probably be the first thing you do when you go back on social media. Keep in mind now, none of the co-conspirators were ever brought to justice for their involvement in the over 24 bombings that occurred throughout the early 70s. But by the mid-70s, the group had fractured into smaller units, or some left the group altogether to form other organizations. Now, the reason why the radicalism, why it kind of tampered off, is because, well, they essentially succeeded in a sense because the United States had surrendered. They surrendered French Indochina. They surrendered the Southeast. And so it came under the sway of communism. Vietnam fell. Cambodia fell. Laos fell, and so on. I think it was 1973 was the year that Richard Nixon sort of decommissioned, or, you know, there was no draft, essentially. Then, well, for some strange reason, all the anti-war activists went away. And when the war was over, all of a sudden, there was no more talks of peace, because as the peoples of Indochina was being slaughtered, as hundreds of thousands of Chinese native, or those of Chinese heritage and ancestry were being murdered in Vietnam, the left, they didn't have anything to say about it. Mum's the word. So the peace activists, the hippies, the beatniks, the radicals, they went away. But many of them stayed gone because they were on the run. In 1978, former members of the Weather Underground, Elizabeth Ann Duke, Judith Alice, David Gilbert, and Kathy Bodin, there she goes popping up again, would start another group called the May 19th Communist Organization. the May 19th Communist Organization. Now, what is the May 19th Communist Organization known for? Notice David Gilbert was the only male mentioned. The May 19th Communist Organization fashioned itself as this new kind of anti-feminist communist organization. I guess there was too much sexism in the Weathermen. I don't know. But again, this always tends to happen. Again, the SDS fractured away and created the Weathermen, and the Weathermen fractured away. And, you know, you had the May 19th Communist Organization start from there. But by the late 1970s, the Weathermen were pretty much no more. Now, what are the May 19th Communists most known for? Some of you are familiar with this. In 1981, in Inuit, New York, several members of the Black Liberation Army and 4 members of the May 19th Communist Organization would attempt to rob a Brinks truck, which resulted in the death of 1 Brinks security guard and 2 Nanuet police officers, one of which was the only black officer on the force. The chief architect of the failed heist was none other than the now deceased stepfather of famed rapper Tupac Shakur, Mutulu Shakur. Now, I said earlier when I started that I want to get Obama out the way because I got some big fish to fry. I'm gonna fry Johnny Cochran, and then I'm gonna fry Tupac's ass. And I wonder if any of you from Vlad TV, everybody's running around talking about Kevy D and Puffy and this, that, and the third. Everybody want to know who shot. I don't give a damn who shot Tupac. I live a thug life, baby. I'm hopeless, choking off window, trying to keep my focus. Don't let that bullshit worry me. Fuck the fame, I'm true to the game till they bury me. Why do I listen? Why should I care who in the hell shot such a man? As if niggas don't die every day for saying the type of he said and living the kind of lifestyle that he promoted. But everybody wants to know who shot Tupac. I wonder if they're going to bring me on their platform to talk about Tupac and his background. Are they going to bring me on their platform to talk about Tupac and his stepfather? Huh? And his godfather, Geronimo Pratt. Oh, I'm going to get into all of them because I hear a lot of folk, I see a lot of talking in the street about how great of a Tupac Shakur, the greatest left-wing icon of the late 20th century, a hero, a martyr. The same way we've sitting up here, and I'm sorry if it's going to make some of y'all mad, but even some of y'all conservatives blindly make martyrs out of men like Fred Hampton because he died unjustly at the age of 21. Well, a man's legacy is not marked by how he died. His legacy is defined by how he lived. I don't give a damn how he met his end. It was bad, it was bad, it was wrong, it was wrong. But what did he stand for? A communist is a communist no matter how you slice him. Fred Hampton is no hero. Tupac Shakur is no hero. And in due time, I'm going to come for each and every last one of them. And Tupac, you're on my list too. And let me get back to your trifling ass stepfather. May God have mercy on his soul. The purpose of the robbery was to amass funds for the Republic of New Africa, a black separatist movement of which Shakur was a major proponent. The May 19th members who were charged and convicted for their involvement in the Brinks truck robbery were Judith Clark, David Gilbert, and Kathy Bodin. Now, let me briefly explain this. Some of y'all may have heard me give this story, and some of y'all are probably familiar with this story. Assata Shakur, all of them, the whole Shakur clan, miscreants, malcontents, and misfits. Oh, man, but they stood for so much power and black this and liberation and this, that, and the third. Now, Kathy Bodin. Who is Kathy Bodin? Now, Judith Clark, David Gilbert, and Kathy Bodin, they were the members of the May 19th organization that were captured. Now, as a side note, Kathy Bodin, she was an integral part of SDS and the Weathermen Weather Underground organization. Well, Kathy Bodin, unlike many of her other comrades, she in fact was a red diaper baby because her father, Leonard Bodin, was a famous attorney for the Communist Party. Many of his famous clients include Daniel Ellsberg. of Pentagon paper fame. Also, her father, Leonard Bodin, was the personal attorney for none other than Paul Robeson. He was also the personal attorney of Fidel Castro. Her great uncle, her great granduncle, her granduncle was another communist, a godlike figure by the name of Louis Bodin. So just when you get a chance, look into the legacy and the life of the Bodin family. When you get a chance, Boudin, from Kathy Bodin, Leonard Bodin to Louis Bodin. Kathy Bodin grew up, albeit she was a red diaper baby. Her father was a famous lawyer who, of course, worked for the National Lawyers Guild, the ACLU, and so on and so forth. Right? So, as a lawyer, her father was a very well-paid lawyer, very successful lawyer. So she, too, grew up in privilege. She grew up in a wealthy section of Brooklyn, New York. The home in which Kathy Bodin grew up in was the facade home depicted in the show, The Cosby Show. So when you watch The Cosby Show, you know on sitcoms, they show you the house, and then it cuts to the inside of the home, which is the set, right? And so when you saw the outside, this is what in show business they refer to as facade home. So the facade home of The Cosby Show was the actual childhood home of Weather Underground member Kathy Bodin. Now, quickly, the May 19th Communist Organization and the Black Liberation Army were kind of partners. And so when they came, they sort of came under the same umbrella, so to speak. The point of the May 19th organization was to sort of give cover, aid, and comfort to the Black Liberation to the Black Liberation Organization, because they were white, college educated, were acceptable, and the blacks, on the other hand, were because of racism and blah 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 blah. So they figured that if they align themselves, then they can get more accomplished. So when they aligned themselves, they united under one banner that they referred to as the family. The reason why